Johnny, welcome, man.
Hey everybody, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing good. Stoked about today. Nice. I think I'm the first speaker today, so that's a little. I really got to get the levels high today.
That's right. The pressure's on.
I know.
So, Johnny, what's the workshop, man? What do you got in store for us?
Yeah, no, I'm super stoked. I wanted to touch on this concept of from telemetry to triage, because often what we find is, I started my career off in detection engineering, and it's very easy to get stuck in the detection engineering bubble without thinking about who is going to triage these alerts, right? And oftentimes what we find is those who create the detections aren't the ones that are triaging the detections. And so there's constantly this struggle back and forth of, why aren't analysts looking at these more behavioral based alerts without realizing, when you start to triage these things from, a scale perspective, it's super hard to do. And so we need to align the expectations and go forward with the detection strategy internally and build upon that over time. So it's super, super fun. I'm going to dive into some of the SOC challenges, dive into some really cool detection engineering concepts, and kind of show how we can bridge those two things together.
Awesome. Jam-packed, man. Looking forward to it. Cool. Greg, anything you want to cover with Johnny too? Otherwise, we're going to hand it off to him. Now you're mute.
You're muted, Greg.
Yeah.
I work with Johnny during my day job. I get enough of him. So no, Johnny's brilliant. He brings a lot of interesting insights, particularly to Windows internals. So it's always fun to hang out and talk with him. I always learn something. So hopefully everybody here gets some value out of his talk, and I'm almost certain you will. So, and that's just a teaser to his more awesome course.
Absolutely. Johnny, go ahead, share your screen, man, and then we're going to get it up, and then Greg and I are just going to smoke bomb disappear.
I'm going to share my whole screen today, everybody, because I'm going to be going back and forth between a couple of things.
Okay.
So let me see if this...
Dangerous territory, my guy.
Yep.
Is it sharing?
Let's take a look. I don't see it yet. Nope, go ahead.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, 1 second. Let me just...
We should see like a little boop on our end.
There you go.
Yep. There it is. Add to the scene. Cool. Okay, let's set you up over there. And that's it. Johnny, man, it's all yours. Chat, enjoy. Awesome. Ask him lots of questions. He likes to answer questions.
That's right. And if I'm working on one screen today, everybody. So if I'm slow to answer some questions, just bear with me and I'll promise I'll get to them. So first and foremost, welcome everybody. Day 2, super exciting. This is a super, super cool con. It's done differently than a lot of other conferences where there's a lot of really cool hands-on workshops. And we're really excited to do that. I think with hands-on workshops, not only do you get to understand like the methodology behind whoever's teaching the thing, but you get to actually implement it and practically play with it and learn those skill sets along with how the instructor is going about it. So today I wanted to dive into this concept called from telemetry to triage, and it's aligning detection strategy with SOC reality. And I know this sounds more of a conceptual based workshop, and to an extent parts of it is, but a lot of it has a lot of practical application. So the agenda today, we're going to dive into the problem. I think with every good talk, every good workshop, we have to understand what is the problem we're trying to solve here. And then we're going to dive into the reality of the SOC workflow, right? What do they typically deal with? What are the struggles that they have with that, et cetera? And then the challenges of alert classification. At the end of the day, analysts' real job is to classify alerts, right? And so how can we get them to classify alerts maybe faster, maybe more efficiently, more effectively, more accurately, right? And so that's always the question, is how do you minimize the time from which an analyst gets an alert to the point of classification? And then we're going to talk about crafting effective detection strategies. This really boils down to 2 different things, and how your organization wants to answer those things, which we'll dive into. And then we want to bridge the detection and SOC alignment to bring them and help them realize that you're just 2 different teams working under the same organization with the same goal, the same values, and trying to make sure the organization stays safe. A little bit about me starting off. My name is Johnny Johnson. Everything You might see me as Jonathan Johnson. I go by Johnny. It's fine. My Twitter handle is up at top. My Twitter handle used to be JSecurity101. It was an old one. I just changed it probably like 3 weeks ago. I had it since college, and I thought it was about time to switch it up a little bit. I started an LLC so I could start doing more trainings with Level Effect. And super excited about a course that we have coming up. Also, my day job, I'm the principal Windows EDR product researcher at Huntress. Super excited, get to work with some great people like Greg, John Hammond, a bunch of others, and very lucky for that. I started my career off as a detection engineer at SpectreOps. Many of you might have heard that. And I also, helped build another course over there, and then helped with like the purple team whenever it was originally being stood up. And then also was a threat researcher at Red Canary and Binary Defense. So it was a lot of fun. My main focus is in Windows. I think a lot of the detection strategy methodology obviously can be mirrored over to not only the Windows operating system, but also like say Linux or Mac, or whatever it may be. The concepts are still the same. But what you'll see me today talk about is mostly like Windows attacks and techniques, but those can definitely be mirrored to other operating systems without a problem. Another big interest of mine is extracting, exposing telemetry. I'm a big telemetry guy. How can we look at telemetry differently? How can we expose this to where it's actionable for detection engineers in the SOC? All of those type of things are big things of mine. And I've done some like open source things as well. Atomic Test Harnesses by Red Canary. I also have my own kind of like public EDR project called JonMon, which is really cool. And I just released a similar one called JonMon Lite, which shows how you can do like remote EDR capabilities, which is really fun. So enough about me. Let's dive into the content. So the problem, detection engineers, there's this often misaligned expectations. You have detection engineers, they want to do the really cool stuff, right? They want to see all the behavioral stuff. Maybe that's like all the new process injection based stuff, some of the CVE, some of the 0 days, etc. And you can create analytics to maybe see those things, but it doesn't mean every analytic should be a detection, because analysts, it's really hard for them to be able to look into those because they have to do classification. And the more noise there is, the harder classification is, the more time it takes, but also you could misclassify easier over time. And it causes alert fatigue and all these different things. So you have these misaligned expectations commonly. And you want to find the middle ground. And this middle ground changes over time. If you're a new organization, you're just starting out, we'll dive into this. You might start very small. You might have more precise detections, very high fidelity alerts, because your SOC team might be 4 or 5 people, right? You might have, I've seen it to where the same detection engineers are the SOC analysts. So they're doing both. And so it's really hard to juggle both things. And so you have to design a system where you can kind of both do some maybe broad behavioral based detections and make sure the triage efficiency is there as well. So that's ideal. And that, again, that needle can move over time. There's common friction. And I think we don't talk about this enough in the industry, but there's common friction between SOC analysts and detection engineers, or maybe even like threat hunting and detection and all these different things. And it simply comes down to like, why can't they triage these alerts? What's the issue? Why don't they understand them? Why can't like detection engineering tune the alerts? And the most common thing that I hear, especially on my day job, is I need more data in order to do this. And we'll dive into that as well here shortly. But these are the common friction points that you often hear. It's either this team's not doing what we think they should do, or we don't have enough data to be able to do it. And some of that may be true over time. But could we align those expectations to what the current solution is and help both teams be efficient and effective? So let's dive into the SOC workflow reality. Let's just say theoretically you're a SOC analyst, right? And you open up an alert that just popped up. It's called remote thread creation. And this is all you see, right? You see this, you dive into, you click on this like bottom left-hand thing, you see events, and you dive into, and you see there's 2 events. So, with this one alert, there's 2 different things you have to dive into. And that makes it hard because let's say you're digging through the data, you're digging through the query. The query is like as simple as, seeing like maybe a high integrity level process and a system level integrity process being created, or thread being created from, another one. And it starts to cause issues because maybe you're a new analyst and you're like, okay, I don't even really understand what a thread creation is. Why is that even important? What does this pertain to? And oftentimes we see this has to do with like process injection, right? And so you start to dive through this, and it's starting to take more time because now you maybe need to realize, okay, like, is this really bad? And you know, what's interesting is like remote thread creation can happen as simply as if someone runs like run as, or oftentimes, let's say you spawn a PowerShell host and you see, you know, have you ever seen like CMD or PowerShell? You see like con host with that. You often see remote thread creation with that. And you'll often see that that's either being excluded or needs to be tuned, but it's starting to be like a lot of data. And what you see is this is a very behavioral based alert. And it's like, okay, this is a little difficult now. And I'm not really understanding this. So you request, hey, detection engineering, could you tune this a little bit? And then they start to tune it. And you're still having these issues of, okay, like this isn't really catching that much bad. So what do we do? And that's one end of the spectrum, right? So that's very far, very behavioral. And then let's say, this is an example, a screenshot of how this could look. This is of the raw data. And you'll see like PowerShell here. Again, you'll see this, you know, you have a source process Panther, and a starter user Panther. I have this project called Marvel Lab. And so you'll see a lot of Marvel isms in here. I'm a big Marvel fan. But you see that like PowerShell, you know, spawned a remote thread creation inside a con host. And it's like, okay, well, like, what do you do with this now? Like, is this really bad? Like, where's the context? Like, what can you really see? Like, okay, that threads execute code. So like, how do you know what code was executing con host? So we have these issues, and this is on one end of the spectrum where it's really, really broad. And you're like, okay, like, how do I deal with this? And then let's say you see another alert, and this on the other end of the spectrum, and it's more of like encoded PowerShell command. And you dive into it, and it's pretty straightforward here. You see like PowerShell, you know, had encoded command, and this was just something I ran with like my local machine. And you see that I downloads this like PS1 from like this port 8000. Okay, this is very straight to the point. And you might need to do a little more investigation. Okay, like what's happening, but this doesn't look the greatest. And so that's the other end of the spectrum, right? But keep in mind, like not all encoded PowerShell commands are bad. And some places don't even have the decoded command built out for you. You have to kind of manually do that, which stinks. But like Microsoft, a lot of their products, for example, they'll run encoded commands. So you could have a lot of false positives. And so you start to see like on different ends of the spectrum, and this is what's hard for analysts, right? It's like you have one alert, it's extremely broad. And then you have another alert, and it's like maybe more precise. And so it's constant context switching, which is super hard for analysts. And so how do you get this in a way where they can be more efficient, more effective? And you might even have an analyst who's like, I don't even know what a thread is on Windows. And so how do you really expect them to go and do the remote thread creation alert, right? So these are the realities, right? These are what they're faced with on a daily basis. And that's what makes it very hard. So the SOC is flooded with alerts every day. And, you know, really at the end of the day, it's kind of expected them to like read the alert, classify it, investigate a little bit, move on to the next. And so it's like rinse and repeat, fatigue. And they're hit with so many different wide range of telemetry sources, right? You could have different operating systems, right? So you could have like Windows, Linux, Mac. You could also have EDR logs, firewall logs, you know, cloud logs, all of these things. And then you have different detection strategies from like precise, behavioral. You have third-party alerts where it's like, say you're like ingesting MDE alerts, but you also have like your own solutions. And so now you're kind of to triage these like MDE alerts that you can't really tune. And you're kind of like, what does this even do? And it becomes really, really hard, right? And this is the reality of the SOC is it's just kind of like this, I mean, it's a grind. You know, I tell people this all the time. It's like the SOC analyst workflow. I mean, the SOC analyst team, you know, it's hard to believe this sometimes, but they are usually one of the most important teams within the security organization. Every sub team kind of lives to serve the SOC at the end of the day. If you think about it, like think you have a red team. Well, their job is to test detections and see how the SOC like can alert to said detections. Detection engineering obviously serves SOC because they have to create detections so that the SOC can classify said detections. Purple teaming, same situation, right? All of these teams are spread out because they're there to serve the SOC or work at least hand in hand with the SOC. And that's what's hard about, you know, the analyst workflow is it's constant every day and something new could pop up, right? And so on this like left-hand side, you might see like this is like the perfect ideal scenario, right? This is like clean desk, everything's up there. You're kind of just like diving through step by step. The reality is it's kind of more of the right. It's like, not only do you have all these alerts popping up all of a sudden, you might not know what they are. You might have someone hitting you up. It's like, hey, can you go look at this host? There's just a lot going on there, and it becomes really, really hard. And so because of that, you'll often see that, you know, SOC teams want to clear the desk a little bit by making higher fidelity signals, because it helps classification. If they see something and it's like, hey, this is P1, like a priority 1, and you see, I don't know, like it's something really bad, and, you know, detection engineering is tuned enough to where it's like, hey, if this pops, it's bad. That helps the SOC a little bit, but, you know, that's not necessarily how an organization wants to work all the time, because when you start to get to precise things, it's hard to see more of the behavioral stuff. Not all the time, but that's often what it is. Now, let's talk about alert classification here. And we'll just dive through this kind of quickly. I think most of you probably understand this. But classification is simple. All it is the process of assessing and categorizing alerts, right? You see an alert, you need to classify, is this like bad, or is it not bad, or is this testing, or what is it? And there's different alert categorization, right? You have true positives, false negatives. And I think the majority of the time in our industry, what we hear about most is false positives. And you can go on probably Twitter today and look up false positives, and there's probably 10, you know, there's a lot of people probably giving their opinions on false positives and how to handle them, right? It's a very hot topic. And then you have different severity levels of different detections, and this is like to help with priority. You could have informational, those are typically contextual alerts. Low, where it's like, hey, like, yeah, this maybe could be bad, but it's also probably like admin doing something weird. Medium, it's like, hey, this is starting to look pretty bad. It doesn't happen a lot of the times, but it's got enough context to it that it's like, hey, this is a little odd. And then you have high, which is like, this is probably pretty bad. And then critical, where it's like, the sky is falling. It's very bad. And then you have different recommended steps of what to do after you classify, right? You could escalate, remediate, dismiss it, investigate it more, etc. Right? That's typically the workflow of classification. And so, like I mentioned, there's different classification levels. This is very high level. This is not meant to like dive deep into this, because I think there's a lot of like vocabulary isms that people like to be more specific about here, but this is just, you know, high level for the sake of this workshop. You have false positives, and those are like benign events. It was like flagged as a malicious alert. And what you find oftentimes is, like, let's say, and this is like the reason why analysts would want a detection engineer to tune an alert, right? Is because this analytic alerted on something that's actually not bad. And then I'll dive back into the false positive aspect here in a moment. I'll give you my thoughts. And then you have true positives. This is a legit threat. It was flagged as malicious. You have false negatives, event that was expected to trigger the alert, but it didn't. This could be due to over-tuning, which we'll dive into here in a little bit. And then you have like true negatives. The benign event is correctly flagged as like non-malicious. The first three is really what you hear about a lot of the time. Really the first two. And false positives are interesting because it's like you create this analytic that's supposed to catch this behavior, and it caught said behavior, but it's not necessarily the behavior that you want, because you want it to be malicious. And so there's always some debate whether or not that's like a true false positive, or it's like, hey, that's true positive, but we only want malicious ones of those. So like we want to move and maneuver those, etc. And then this dives into signal to noise ratio. Like, why does all this matter? Signal to noise ratio is just simply the balance between like a useful alert, aka a signal, and irrelevant, like low priority alerts or noise. Typically you want to, you know, most of the time people want a higher SNR with signal to noise ratio, which means detections are more precise, they're less fatiguing, and they're easier to action on, which makes life a little easier there, right? You know, if like you're pretty confident that whenever you get an alert, this is going to be pretty bad. And you can do something with it. Where like the lower the SNR, this typically happens whenever people try to implement too many behavioral based alerts without enough context. And then you have like low confidence as an analyst of set alerts. And due to that, fatigue increases, which is not ideal. Like there is this concept, right, where it's like you're an analyst, you're dealing with so many alerts, and you've seen this alert pop up. You see this like alert popping up so many times. You're just writing it off in your head. You're like, yeah, the majority of the time this is like not bad. So I'm just not, every time I see it, I'm just going to like toss it off to the wayside. Or you start to have this concept, which I won't dive into today. It's a very interesting, you know, thought provoking concept where it's like, as an analyst, is your goal to investigate something to the point to where it's like you want to prove that it is malicious or prove that it is benign? And I think you want to live obviously in the middle somewhere, but oftentimes as an analyst, if you are an analyst and you're here, think to yourself, when I go into and I look at an alert, do I often try to do everything I can to prove that it's benign, or I try to do everything I can prove that it's malicious? And there's alert bias there whenever that happens, but we won't dive into that today. But if anybody wants to talk about that, please hit me up. I'm more than happy to talk about that. And so we got to ask ourselves, why all the noise? And you know, I think it's interesting because noise is organizational specific, because it depends what your organization allows, and in terms of like applications, like what do you have, like preventative capability, all these different things. And so a lot of times our administrators, right? Like once upon a time when I was a detection engineer, I had a client once ask us to create PS exec detections. And then upon doing so, part of that process obviously is like search the data in the organization and see how often that happens. It's happening literally all the time. And then we're like, well, it looks like you guys are like allowing PS exec. And they're like, oh yeah, admins are allowed to use PS exec. So we just want you to like find all the malicious ones. Well, that's hard, right? Where it's like, okay, well, like, what does that even mean? And so you kind of have to like play with that, and it's hard. And that's what I mean by it's organizational specific, because some places are like, no, you're not allowed to do these things. And other places are like, yeah, you kind of have free reign to like download whatever application you want, which causes a lot of issues. And then you also have like RMMs. RMMs do a lot of sketchy things under the hood. They're on Windows, at least. They're just simply like wrappers around like native things. Like a lot of them just do like WMI, WinRM, things like that. And so it's unnecessary noise. And then you have like least privilege, like who has admin rights, and you know, how big is your organization? You might have the time where it's like someone asked for this, got it, they forgot to like revoke it, and so then you're like, what do I do? And stuff. So can you really write like the detections like that? Like the PS exec example, can you really write a PS exec detection when everyone is running PS exec? It's hard. And so these kind of factors help determine at what level detections are written, right? So let's talk about detection strategies. Let me take a sip of water real quick. And so when it comes to detection strategy, there's really two continuous questions. And this was getting at the very beginning. You have, what signal to noise ratio can we live with today? And that means whenever I'm creating the detection, where's the threshold? What can the analyst handle? Because alerts need to be actionable, not just possible. I think like I've written a lot of detections. I'm like, hey, this is actually really cool. I can see this thing. You know, it's not a lot of like actionable for an analyst. I probably wouldn't want to be I wouldn't want to be, you know, triaging that alert. I might have joined like 4 different data sources and like, oh, this is super sick, but it's like, okay, well, yeah, that's kind of like a cool factor, but it's like, is this really actionable? And like I mentioned, like analysts need enough context to classify quickly and confidently. And there is like detection volume that have to align with human capacity. So you can't just have like a whole bunch of alerts and only like 3 analysts. And then it's like, okay, well, if we had more analysts, our strategy could probably be a little more behavioral, but we don't have enough personnel, and that's really tough, right? And then the second piece is, how can we create meaningful detections within the limitation while pushing the needle forward? Because ideally, most places don't want to live within the current place that they're at for a super long time, because things are happening on the daily basis. You might have different CVs, different exploits that come out. Someone on Twitter found this new like way to do process injection, and detection engineers are like naturally curious, or analysts. And so it's like, well, can I create a detection for this? Oh, I can. But I think oftentimes what we see is there's a confusion between an analytic and a detection. Not every detection, not every analytic is a detection, but every detection has an analytic backed by it, right? And so we have to keep that in mind whenever we dive through that. And so we have to invest in richer telemetry to surface like better signals. We also need to find ways whenever we're pushing the signal forward, like how can we get more context? Is that like playbooks? Is that, you know, writing documentation and educating the SOC? Because that's a big problem, right? Is like a lot of times it's like analysts are like brand new to this gig, right? They're new to this whole cybersecurity thing. And that's super exciting. And they can just drink from the fire hose of like knowledge. but someone's kind of got to lead them a little bit. It can't just be like tossed like, okay, now go look at this alert. It becomes tough, right? And we have to think of those two things whenever we're building out a detection strategy. Now, there was this concept that was released by Jared Atkinson at SpectreOps a couple of years ago whenever I was working there. It's very simple. It's just this line. And on the very left side here, what you'll see precise. And this is meant to really just like, I don't know, surface what detections could be and where they live within this like playing field or the spectrum that we call it. On the left side, you have precise, and you have low false positives, high false negatives, which means the closer you are to the far left, the more confident you are when an alert fires, this is bad. And you should do something about this, and it's not the greatest. Where on the more right side, you have broad or behavioral. Think of broad and behavioral thing. And you'll see is like high false positives, low false negatives. And the more you go, and I'll touch on this here in a moment, but the more you go on that side, the harder it is to classify. And so you're starting to become less confident unless you add more telemetry for correlation. Now, on the left side, you probably heard of precise. If you haven't, you might have heard of brittle. We kind of chose to stay away from that just because precise detections are bad, and you use the term brittle, it makes it sound like it's bad. Precise detections have a place, and they could just be low-hanging fruit. Now, keep in mind, you often hear or see that there is like a pull between precise and broad or behavioral. Now, neither one is bad. And I think oftentimes you'll see like someone is like all about precise detections, and they're like behavioral, no one can do anything with that. But you'll have someone behavioral who's like, these are the way to go. This is how you really can move the needle forward in detection. Precise is bad, but that's not the case. Like if I was standing up an organization today, I would be doing precise detections off the rip just because of low-hanging fruit, while trying to build out the analytic platform and the technologies to be able to do behavioral and broad detections, right? So they both have a place, and we need to have respect for both of them. But the question becomes like, where do you want to live? So let's dive into like more of like what this means. So let's say like you have like a detection precise for mimikatz.exe, right? That would be a precise detection, because anytime you see mimikatz.exe like launched, you're like, oh, this is bad. This could be also like a hash of mimikatz.exe. It could just be like command lines that relate to Mimikatz, right? So that would be more precise. And then you know, probably like a more common one that you might see is like open process. This was a big one that was around for the longest time. Is like, well, because there wasn't really like a good way to determine that credential dumping for LSAS was happening, because there wasn't really good data. And I'll touch on what that data piece is here in a second. But like for a long time there was only like, okay, either use the process command line or use this thing called open process. But the problem with open process is it really lives like over here. I made that terrible. It really lives kind of broad, and it's hard to determine whether or not that's like LSAS being, or like not LSAS, whether or not that like open handled LSAS is bad. So what people often did is like, okay, well, I'm going to look at certain access rights with that handle, and I'm not going to dive into what handles and all it is. But what you'll find is like, okay, I'll limit it, but that really moves it over here a little bit and makes it a little more precise, because then like people aren't looking for other access rights. So it's easy to kind of quote unquote bypass that analytic and still perform dumping LSAS the way they wanted to. And so you often saw like mimikatz.exe. You might see like hashes, which is like really over here because you have to have like a lot of them. And then you might have command lines, which is still kind of like, honestly, it's the same spot as this here. And so you kind of had this like realm here, and people really didn't know what to do. And it was like, okay, so like, what do I do here? And it makes that tough, right? And then you would have like read process memory of LSAS, and this comes from like the threat intelligence ETW provider. And this is really cool because like when someone goes to dump LSAS, they have to read like LSAS's memory. There are some limitations. I'm not going to dive into what with this telemetry source. But you know, it is behavioral, it is broad, and it is at a point to where it's like good enough to where it's over here. But if you like, LSAS's memory could be read for other reasons besides for malicious use. So this could have false positives, and that's kind of the issue, right? Is you'd want to then like, I don't know, have this detection, circle back. Okay, who is the source? process? Was it like signed? You know, you start to get in these things. And this is the point, is the more right you go, which we'll touch on the next slide, the more right you go, the more data you need in order to classify. And that's where it becomes tough, right? So this is what I was mentioning, is the more right you go, the more data you need in order to correlate and classify. A good example of this is remote service creation. So like you could create a detection easily over here on the precise side for like PS exec, right? You could do that, and that would probably live like on this realm of like remote service creation. But people can create remote services all the time and it not be this. And so what are you going to do about this whole realm over here? And so you have to start joining things where it's okay, this registry key was created, and where did it come from? And was there a network connection tied to it? Okay, now what about the image? Is the image bad? You see what I mean? Like you have to start asking these questions, because although if you pull up like Procmon and you execute remote service creation, you see it immediately with a registry event. But in like services are created all the time, and seeing that registry creation isn't necessarily bad. So you can't just push that into a detection, because how's an analyst going to go about classifying that? It becomes really tough. And so you have to start thinking of what are these other data points that I would need in order for an analyst to take this cool analytic and turn that into a practical one that can be a detection, and in turn classify properly, right? So, and then what happens as well is, let's say you want to do a service creation based detection. And I think what's often forgot about is, you know, when it comes to tuning, you often hear about exclude this process, exclude this process. Whenever you include processes as well, you're also pushing the needle left to more precise for an analytic. And so, like if you're looking like service creation from like non-SCM process, aka like not services.exe, you would see if someone like manually set a registry key for that service key, but it's going to be like you're missing a large part of them, because most people are going to do like se.create or just call create service W or something like that. You're missing this full right point here, and that's really tough. And so I hope everybody's seen here the difficulty now, that what I was talking about in the beginning of a struggle, the back and forth between analysts want to be able to classify things, and you know, detection engineers need to be able to make an actionable alert. And sometimes it's so hard, because it's like, okay, well, where is the soft spot here, the middle ground? Okay. And here's an example that I kind of pulled up for, like, let's say Kerber roasting, right? You have like a broad alert. So every time someone like wants to request a service ticket, they do that, and there's a 4769 created on the domain controller. Well, if you just create a detection for that, you'll see there's 199 there's count over like the past, like, I think I had this at like 12 hours. Like it's pretty loud. Okay, so like that would be on the broad side. And in the perfect world, it would almost be perfect if you cast a net where you could do all broads and then somehow take out all the false positives, and then you would have that. Like that would be the most ideal scenario. What happens though is people are like, okay, that's a lot. So now I need to implement something that like is happening a decent amount of time. So like someone's requesting a service ticket in RC4 format. And now you've done it. Now you've like overcompensated in a sense, because now you have this precise detection, and people could request a ticket that's like AES, for example. And this is what the common struggle is, where it's like you kind of have to. It's hard to find a middle ground, and so what often happens is people include only RC4 format, and so it puts it way over to precise, because you've excluded literally everything else without explicitly excluding it, and that's what makes it tough. Now, what often is found, and you know how this is typically approached, is there's typically a cap by which broad detections are allowed to go. AKA, this is like we call it the threshold, the false positive threshold, and you'll see that's the blue line here. And this is like being very generous. Like very, 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 very little organizations are actually this far right in terms of behavioral-based alerts. And then what happens is you might have like another team like threat hunting come in, and they will push more towards behavioral. So they'll have they'll have analytics that like cannot be deemed detections because there's not a good way to classify them. And they'll run these things and threat hunt and try to explore these other analytics and see, hey, there was this alert, we found more, I think this could be a detection. They would have a conversation with detection. And the only difference between like a threat hunting analytic and a detection engineering, I guess, detection or analytic, is the actionable aspect. Like, can an analyst classify this in? That's the literally only difference, because the reason why it has to live in threat hunting is because someone has to manually look at it and then do more data manipulation in order to make a decision, and that's what's tough. And then you have on that aspect as well, like I mentioned, like this is pretty conservative, so you often see this like more blue, more left than what you see over there. So you might, a good example of this, kind of like what I was just mentioning, is like the Kerberos aspect. Threat hunting might go through and like have these different analytics to run through for which, like where Kerberos could happen. And then when they start to find that the false positive ratio of that starts to go down, they might like approach detection engineering and say, hey, we have this detection, this analytic that would fit your threshold. Would you like to look at it, etc. So determining detection strategy. It's like, okay, Johnny, you've explained all these struggles. Like, how do we figure this out? Well, there's two pieces here. There's telemetry collection, which is like, do you have the appropriate telemetry to be able to do correlations? Is the data of that standardized in a way that you could start to do joins and things like that and provide context, et cetera? Do you have a lot of like collection coming in, or is it relatively limited? These are all questions. And like, how rich is that data? And I think oftentimes what people do is they'll ingest all this data, which I was getting at the beginning. It's like, I need more data. People ingest more data, but not think, okay, like, does this source and this source work well together for this outcome? And that should be really the question before just ingesting all of these logs. And then you have false positive tolerance. I think oftentimes what people will say, if you ask them, like, what's your false positive tolerance? Like, oh yeah, we can deal with false positives. And then it's like, well, is that really true? Because then they start to get like alerts coming, like process injection ones. And then all of a sudden there's a call in your calendar, and it's like about tuning detections, and that's part of the detections you have to tune. So being honest with your detection engineering team, if you're like a SOC team, of where you guys currently are at and what you would need in order to progress forward is really key. And for detection engineering, understanding where your telemetry collection really is at and how rich that is and what analysts will need in order to classify, that's really key. So let's say your false positive tolerance is high, which the majority of people are not. You can offer more broad, more behavioral-based detections. You'll see a lot more of everything, but you need to be able to handle that. And you need to have a technology in the back end, especially on the next slide, that can handle that as well. So that might be like playbooks, et cetera, a different team that would like look at all these things, et cetera. These examples could be like LSAS, reinforced memory, service modification, scheduled tasks, et cetera. And then it saves low. You kind of have to, you really got to worry about like that fidelity of the detection. Like, if this triggers, is this going to be bad? What's the efficacy of this, et cetera? And so use like known malicious hashes, specific command lines, process-based stuff, really, at the end of the day. And is one really better than the other? This is what I was getting at the very beginning. Maybe midway of the detection spectrum aspect. And I was a consultant once, so I'll give you the consulting answer. It really depends. Like, where's your organization at? What's the maturity of your SOC? What's the maturity of your detection engineering team? How will they flow together? What's your tech stack? All of these things. Like I said, to be honest with you, if I was to start an organization today and build it all from the ground up, I would have behavioral and broad in my mind while I built the tech stack, but implement more precise low-hanging fruit, because it's easy low-hanging fruit. Why not have it? Because let's say you have a behavioral one and you have precise trigger, like your behavioral ones are triggering properly, et cetera. So that there's value in that, but I try to push that needle more to the right. And there's also the aspect of like, what type of technique should you really be looking at as an organization, which we're not going to dive into today. But that is a question by which you kind of have to have when it comes to protection strategy as well. As like, do you really care about like initial access or like all the exfiltration stuff? And that's where it kind of comes into like, oh, I found this cool thing. This might help me catch like things every 1% of the time, but it's not great. So high tolerance sounds cool, but it's a lot of work and it's a lot of process, and you have to continuously be marching forward to that. And I think oftentimes that fight to get more right in that spectrum often gets dropped over time because it is exhausting. It can be, at least. So the common challenges in order to move that, like I mentioned, is tactical limitations. You could have EDR gaps, meaning like your EDR isn't providing the right telemetry. You could have analytical platform constraints, meaning like you might be dealing with an analytical platform that like you can't really do joins, can't really do lookups very well. You can, but it's really hard, and you have to build like a pipeline. It's difficult. Then you have like a lack of enrichment. Like whenever you get an alert that's processed, like can you go out to VT, for example, and like look up its VT score, or you kind of limit it on that. And then you have like automation shortfalls, playbooks are unsupported or unused. AI is a big thing nowadays. I think I'll touch on that real quick. I think like AI can be used to help enrich data or help analysts do their workflow, but it shouldn't ever be used to classify because you need that human element to truly know. And so there's that. There's my 2 seconds on that. If anyone's curious, I can talk about that more. Personal difficulties. You might have a smaller, newly formed team, so limited experience or coverage. You also could have like junior analysts. So like you might have someone who's like kind of fresh out of college, or just kind of like not even out of college, just kind of fresh. And they've never really they don't know what PowerShell is. They don't know what's good about PowerShell, what's bad about PowerShell. And so there's training overhead that you need to have. And so it's like, okay, like, is there that? And detection engineering is in charge of helping educate the SOC to an extent. And then there's like knowledge gaps, kind of like how I mentioned, incomplete understanding of like attacker behavior, misunderstanding of like what process injection really is, and what the importance of like seeing that activity is. So detection to SOC strategy alignment. By the way, if anybody's asking questions, like I mentioned, I'm on one screen, so I will be looking at the chat at the very end of this and just kind of like scrolling through and answering questions. So I apologize if I haven't been doing it.
Johnny, sorry, gonna pop in there, man. Actually, it's a good segue over there. We're kind of coming up on time. So Q&A period over there. I'm not sure how much more you got to cover. How much you kind of want to?
I have 2 slides maybe, and then I'm
going.
Yep, 2 or 3 slides, and then I'm gonna dive into the exercise. Yep.
Cool. Okay, so we're gonna have to probably cut it off a little bit there, just because we got Natasha coming in over here pretty shortly. So I don't know if you want to cover a slide or you want to take any Q&A. How you feeling with that?
Yeah, let me show the exercise real quick, and
then
I'll take the QA, and then we'll go from there.
Cool. Let's go ahead. So, hope everyone's enjoying Johnny's overview as well too.
Yeah, I can ramble a little bit, everybody, so I apologize. It's a skill that Greg loves, I think.
Anybody who's gone through our courses that's had me an instructor knows I can certainly ramble my fair share.
Yeah,
it's easy. All right, Johnny, go ahead, and then we'll see if we can take maybe a question or two, and then we got to bring Natasha on live.
Absolutely. Sorry for going a little bit over here, guys. So the exercise is called From Telemetry to Triage, similar to the workshop, and it's very simple. The idea is not to give you a step-by-step rigid workflow process, but it's simply to give you like a mindful, okay, how would I approach this? Now, it would be better if you had a lab in the sense of like, I don't know, like an AD environment. That's what I have. Like I use Marvel Lab. There's also, Go AD, which is awesome. But it's simply pick a technique, any technique that you want, and start to create detections on that. And then start to map them to the spectrum. Where do they live? Are they signature-based, or precise, or the behavioral? Where do they live? And then ask yourselves, like, what extra data would I need in order to push this into like an actual detection analytic for classification? I do have an example here for curb roasting. And so in here, what I do is I have 4 or 5 different examples. I use KQL, Microsoft Sentinel on the back end, which is like Windows security events, and like sysmon events, etc. on the back end. So I provide some of that if you're curious, but I give examples of how I would walk through this and how I would approach this, but for curb roasting. Last thing I will point out, I don't know if anybody here is from Canada or is an Oilers fan. I'm a Florida Panthers fan, so I intentionally put an Oilers Giphy in here because we just beat them in the Stanley Cup. So I just had to study that. But that is the exercise, and if anybody has questions, obviously feel free to hit me up. But this is a very valuable exercise. This was something I had to do very early on in my career in detection as well. Create these things and then ask the question, how valuable is this analytic, and can I actually use this to catch bad guys? So there it is.
Fantastic, Johnny. Ton of content over there, man.
Yeah,
you're obviously passionate about it, my guy.
Yeah.
Oh, I am.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yep, I love it. To be honest, it's one of those things. You often see you want to see more behavioral based alerts. You want to see the more bad things, and it's really really hard to do so because you often see the offensive side moving really really fast, and the detection side moving kind of slow, and so it's tough. And so I like it quite a bit.
You're referring to speed. We got a question there that sort of talks about that.
That's right.
Yep. So how does he balance between speed and thoroughness, especially within a SOC environment? What's speed on time, and how does he overthink things when it comes to alerts, and how does he deal with it? Okay, so when it comes to time, I think when it comes to like the time by which an analyst needs to go about triaging or actually classifying an alert depends, and I didn't get a touch on this today, but where the detection lives on the spectrum. And that's tough because it might have to do with like, is there enough context there? Or they have to like run a couple queries, etc. And so there's not like a one set time. I expect them to do this in like 45 seconds and go through it. Now, if you have an alert that gets surfaced and you have enrichment, you have VT, you have like contextual where like look back into like the source process, all the things are right in front of there. The only last piece is there needs to be a little snippet about like what the detection is doing. And then I would expect the analyst to be able to go through that pretty well, depending on the level. So timing is dependent on where the detection is on the spectrum, if enrichment is there, and what level the analyst is at. So that's kind of how I approach those things. And I think it is very important, last thing I'll say, is for every detection engineer to spend a week in the SOC, like triaging their own alerts, and do that on a rotation. Like, don't do it once, do it like once or twice a year. And you'll start to understand where the struggles are, etc.
Nice.
Yep.
Johnny, thank you, man. Good stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate it.
If you want to get a hold of Johnny more, hop in Discord. We've got a channel dedicated to his workshop. As you can see, super passionate, super knowledgeable and experienced. So go and hit Johnny up in Discord. Spam him with questions. He'll be happy to help. I saw there were several we couldn't get to, so hit him up over there, and then we'll get to it over there. Johnny, thank you again. Thanks for coming on stream, man.
Thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure.
Yep. As a detection engineer, it's taking everything in me to hold back my commentary. So.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, we'll do a duo with you guys next time then. See how that goes. Johnny, Have a good one, man.
Yep.
Awesome.